My name is Solange Vance. I'm 30 years old, and the evening of my brother's rehearsal dinner was the night I finally understood that a person can only rewrite the story of your life for so long before the documents catch up with him. It happened at the Carmichael Room, the private event space attached to the Allgate Hotel, on a Thursday evening in early October. 53 people in a room that held 60 comfortably, round tables in a herringbone arrangement, white linens, low centerpieces of eucalyptus and white freesia that my brother's fiancée Camille had selected herself, a small string quartet that played through the cocktail hour and then went quiet. I was seated at table 4, between my mother and my Aunt Dorothea, across from two of Camille's cousins who were in from out of town, and who had the pleasant, curious quality of people who are still assembling the map of a family they are about to marry into. I had spoken to them briefly during the cocktail hour, and they had asked what I did and where I lived, and I had answered both questions honestly, which I would not have done if I had known what the next 40 minutes were going to look like. My brother Elliot stood up between the salad course and the entree. He was 35. He had my father's height and my grandmother's ease in rooms, the quality of taking up exactly as much space as was available without appearing to try. He was good at this particular kind of evening, the kind organized around his occasion, and I had watched him work the room during the cocktail hour with the fluency of someone who has been practicing for exactly this moment for 35 years. He liked being the center. He had liked it since we were children, and the family had organized itself around his liking it the way families do, not through deliberate decision but through the accumulation of 1,000 small concessions, each one individually reasonable, that collectively amounted to a structure none of us had chosen, and none of us had examined. He tapped his glass. The room settled. "Before we get to the toasts," he said, "I want to say something about gratitude. About what it means to build something and to know who helped you build it and who—" He paused here, with the timing of a man who has thought about where to place the pause, who rode along. I watched him. "My family has been generous with me," he said. "They've supported my businesses, they've believed in the vision, and there are people in this room tonight who know exactly what I've put into everything we've built together." He looked at our mother. He looked at our Uncle Bernard. He looked at Philip Osei, who was seated at table 6 and who was, in the professional sense, the person in the room who knew most precisely what Elliot had put into what they had built together, and what he had not. "And then there are people," Elliot said, "who have been along for the ride, who have benefited from the work without contributing to it, who my family has carried, out of love, out of loyalty, even when the carrying was not deserved."
He looked at me then.
He looked at me with the specific directness of a man who has decided that this room, this evening, this audience is the right container for what he has been wanting to say. "She owns nothing. She is nothing. And everyone in this room should understand that whatever she tells you about our family, about our properties, about what belongs to who, the truth is simpler than whatever story she's assembled." 53 people. I lifted my water glass. I took one sip. I set it back on the table in the precise center of the ring it had left on the white linen, and I looked at the eucalyptus arrangement in front of me, and I did not move my eyes from it for the count of 10. At table 6, Philip Osei set down his phone. I did not look at him. I did not need to. I knew what had been on his phone. I had been copied on the confirmation at 9:17 that morning. What none of the 53 people in the Carmichael Room knew, what Elliot did not know, what my mother did not know, what Camille did not know, what the two pleasant cousins from out of town assembling their map of our family did not know, was that the deed transfer on the property at Meridian Road had closed at 9 o'clock that morning, that Philip Osei had filed the relevant documents with the county recorder's office at 9:04, and that the confirmation had arrived in my email at 9:17 while I was drinking coffee at my kitchen table and deciding what earrings to wear to the rehearsal dinner. Philip had not yet said a word. He set his phone face down on the table. He folded his hands. He looked across the room at the space slightly above my brother's left shoulder, with the particular stillness of a man who has 40 years of estate law practice and has learned that the correct response to most things is to wait. "I need to go back, because what happened in the Carmichael Room did not arrive without preparation, and the preparation began 8 years before the rehearsal dinner, in the specific circumstances of my father's death and what it left behind. My father, Raymond Vance, died in the spring when I was 22 of a cardiac event that was sudden enough that none of us had prepared for it and slow enough. 3 days in the hospital, that we each had time to arrive at our own private arrangement with the fact of it before it became irrevocable. He left behind a marriage that had been complicated since approximately the mid-1990s, but that my parents had maintained with the particular determination of two people who have built a shared infrastructure and cannot agree on the terms of dismantling it. He left behind a successful independent plumbing supply business that Elliot had been working in since he was 23 and which my father had, in the last 2 years of his life, been transitioning toward handing over. And he left behind 3 properties: the family home on Crescent Avenue, where my mother still lives, a 2-family rental on Meridian Road that he had bought in 2003 as an investment and that had been generating income since before I was old enough to understand what rental income was, and a small commercial unit on Fenwick Street that had been leased to a dry cleaning operation for 9 years and that my father considered his most reliable holding. The estate was organized by Philip Osei, who had been my father's attorney for 22 years and who had drawn up the original documents and the subsequent revisions with the methodical care of a man who understood that the value of estate planning is in the precision of the drafting rather than the elegance of the summary. Philip was in his late 60s at the time of my father's death, the kind of attorney whose pace suggested he had never once hurried and never once been wrong, and who had a habit of looking at you over the top of his reading glasses that communicated, without commentary, that he had heard whatever you just said and was deciding whether to address it. The estate distribution under my father's most recent documents was as follows: the family home to my mother, outright; the plumbing supply business to Elliot, with a structured buyout provision that gave my mother a continuing interest in the business income for 10 years; the Fenwick Street commercial unit to both Elliot and me in equal shares, with a management agreement that designated Elliot as the managing partner; the Meridian Road property, the 2-family rental, to me, held in a trust that Philip would administer until I reached 30 or demonstrated what the document described as consistent independent financial management for a period of 2 years, whichever came first. I was 22 when my father died. The trust provision was not, in isolation, unreasonable. I was young, I had no professional track record, and my father was a careful man who understood that assets managed carelessly erode. What he had not anticipated, and what I understood only gradually over the years that followed, was the degree to which the trust provision would become, in Elliot's hands, a narrative device. Because Elliot was 35 at the time of my father's death and I was 22, and because Elliot had the business and the title and the public standing in the family's professional life, and because the trust provision made it technically accurate to say that I did not own the Meridian Road property in the most direct sense. It was in trust. Philip was the trustee. I was the beneficiary. Elliot had developed, over the 8 years since my father's death, a way of describing my situation that was constructed from accurate component parts and that added up to something profoundly inaccurate. The version of me that Elliot described to people was this: a young woman who had been given a comfortable life by her family, who had not built anything herself, who relied on family generosity for her housing and her income, and who contributed nothing to the family's holdings. This version was assembled from facts. I was the beneficiary of a trust. I did live in one of the units at Meridian Road. I did not have a separate employment income for several years after my father's death. Each fact was verifiable. The version was, in total, a fabrication. Here is what Elliot's version left out. The Meridian Road property was a 2-family structure, upper unit and a lower unit, each a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that had been appreciating steadily since my father bought it. When my father died, the lower unit was occupied by a long-term tenant named Marcus, a retired mail carrier who had been there since 2007 and who paid his rent on the 1st of every month and kept the porch in better condition than my father ever had. The upper unit had been vacant for 3 months due to a transition between tenants that my father had not had time to resolve before he got sick. I moved into the upper unit 2 months after my father's death, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because someone needed to be on site, and Philip had asked me whether I would be willing to serve as the de facto property manager during the trust period, given that Elliot had the business to manage and my mother had the family home to maintain, and I was the one with the background. I had been studying property management as part of a real estate certification program I had enrolled in at 21 before my father got sick, and I said yes. I want to be specific about what managing the Meridian Road property meant in practice, because the specificity is the story. In the first year after my father's death, the property required a full roof inspection following a hailstorm that September, which revealed damage that the insurance covered for $23,700 after I filed the claim, photographed the damage, and negotiated with the adjuster, who had initially offered $14,200 and whom I had countered with an independent inspection report I had commissioned from a contractor named Roy Adebayo, replacement of the water heater in Marcus's unit, which involved coordinating with Marcus on timing, sourcing the replacement unit, and managing the installation by a plumber I found through the Building Trades Association, resolution of a noise complaint from the neighbor at the adjacent property that had been unaddressed since before my father's death, which required 3 conversations and 1 letter that I drafted with Philip's guidance, and the marketing and leasing of the upper unit once I moved back out after 6 months, which I handled myself using the certification program's leasing protocols, resulting in a signed lease with a new tenant, a young woman named Priya, an occupational therapist, at a monthly rent of $1,340, which was $180 more per month than the previous tenant had paid because I had done a comparative market analysis and the previous rent had been below market for 3 years. Philip noted, in our quarterly check-in at the end of the first year, that the property's net operating income had increased by $4,800 over the prior year under my management. He said this without elaboration but with the specific quality of deliberateness that I had come to understand was his version of a compliment. The second and third years at Meridian Road had their own specific requirements. A furnace replacement in year 2, which I project managed from the first estimate to the final inspection, and which came in at $6,400, $1,100 under the median of the 3 bids I had solicited. A tenant change in the upper unit in year 3 when Priya relocated for work, which I handled smoothly enough that there was no vacancy gap between her departure and the arrival of the next tenant, a retired teacher named Gwen who would stay for 4 years and whose references I had verified personally, and an ongoing relationship with the city's building inspection department, which conducted its biennial inspection in year 2 and cited 2 items that I corrected within 30 days, and which the inspector, when he returned, noted in the report as among the most efficiently addressed citations he had processed that quarter. I tell you these details not to establish a resume, but because the details are the argument, because what Elliot described when he said I own nothing, and nothing was a life constructed from his willingness not to look at what was actually happening. He did not look because it did not serve him to look. Elliot's businesses were successful, and his success was real, and it was the success of a man who had inherited a functioning operation and had grown it with genuine competence and genuine energy. What he had also inherited was a position in the family narrative, the eldest, the businessman, the one who had built things, and that position was easier to occupy cleanly if I was nothing. If I was along for the ride. If the charitable interpretation of the Meridian Road Trust provision was also the complete one. I had not corrected this publicly. Not at family dinners, not at the holiday gatherings where Elliot described his portfolio to people who did not know that 2 of the 3 properties in the family's holdings had been managed for 6 years by the person he was implicitly describing as a dependent. Not when my mother's friends asked what I was doing, and my mother said I was figuring things out. Not when Elliot told a business associate at a 4th of July party 3 years ago that his family had a rental situation that practically runs itself, which was accurate in the sense that I had made it run itself, and inaccurate in the sense that it had not run itself before I arrived, and would not run itself if I left. I had not corrected it because I did not have language for it that did not sound like complaint. I had not corrected it because the structure of our family's attention was organized around Elliot's narrative, and I had not yet found a lever that was strong enough to reorganize it. And I had not corrected it because Philip Osei had, over 6 years of quarterly meetings, been building something on my behalf that would correct it without requiring me to raise my voice in a room. The trust provision in my father's estate documents stipulated that the Meridian Road property would transfer to me outright when I reached 30 or demonstrated 2 consecutive years of consistent independent financial management, as evaluated by the trustee. I turned 30 in August, 2 months before the rehearsal dinner. Philip had been conducting the trustee evaluation throughout the preceding year, reviewing the property's financial records, the lease documents, the maintenance logs, the insurance filings, the net operating income figures, the vacancy rate, and the documented history of the decisions I had made and their outcomes. He had also received and reviewed the comparative market analysis I had commissioned in the spring, a professional appraisal that valued the Meridian Road property at $487,000, which was $124,000 more than its assessed value at the time of my father's death. Representing a combination of general market appreciation and the specific improvements I had made to the property over 6 years that had been documented, at Philip's suggestion, in a capital improvements log that I had been maintaining. Since my first year, Philip had determined, in his capacity as trustee, that the conditions for transfer had been met. He had prepared the deed transfer documents in September. He had scheduled the filing for the morning of October 9th, the day of the rehearsal dinner, because the county recorder's office in our city processed filings on a first-in, first-served basis in the morning queue. And Philip was a man who had been doing this for 40 years and who understood that there was no procedural reason to delay the filing and several practical reasons to have it complete before the family event that evening. He had told me the filing date in our September meeting in his customary manner, factual, precise, without elaboration. He had said, "The transfer will be recorded on the 9th. I expect to have confirmation by mid-morning." I had noted this in the calendar on my phone under the entry for the rehearsal dinner, which I had added 2 weeks earlier at my mother's request, and which I had accepted because I was the family member who attended the events and who showed up, which was a habit I had not yet fully examined for what it was costing me. Philip had been invited to the rehearsal dinner by Elliot, who had known Philip since childhood, and who considered him part of the extended family in the way that long-standing professional relationships sometimes become, less a formality than a habit of inclusion. Elliot had not thought carefully about the optics of this. He had not considered what Philip knew, or what Philip had spent the morning doing, or what Philip's presence at table 6 represented in the context of what Elliot was planning to say between the salad and the entree. He had simply invited Philip because Philip had always been at the family events, and this was a family event. At 9:17 in the morning on October 9th, I received the confirmation in my email. I read it twice. I poured another cup of coffee. I decided on the gold earrings rather than the silver ones. I drove to the Allgate Hotel and attended the cocktail hour and answered questions from Camille's cousins about what I did and where I lived, and then I sat down at table 4 and waited for the evening to be what it was going to be. Philip Osei stood up from table 6 at 9:43 in the evening. He did not stand up immediately after Elliot spoke. He waited, the way Philip waited for everything, with a patience that was not passive but structural, the patience of a man who understood that timing was a form of precision and that the correct moment to speak was not the first available moment, but the moment when what needed to be said would be most clearly received. Elliot had finished. He had sat down. He had picked up his wine glass. Camille, to his left, had her hands in her lap and was looking at the table in a way I could see from across the room. Not at me, not at Elliot, at the table, with the expression of a woman who has just heard her fiancé say something in public that she will be thinking about for longer than this evening. My mother had not moved. My Aunt Dorothea, to my right, had placed her hand briefly on my forearm, a pressure, released, and then withdrawn it to her own lap. The 2 cousins from out of town were very still. Philip stood up at 9:43. He had the room's attention before he spoke, because he was 68 and he carried the specific authority of someone who has never needed to perform it, and the room had already registered that something had happened between Elliot's speech and now, and was waiting to understand what came next. "I hope you'll forgive me for adding a word," Philip said. His voice was the voice he used in offices and courtrooms and estate review meetings, unhurried, precisely modulated, carrying the sense that each word had been considered before deployment. "I'm Philip Osei. I was Raymond Vance's attorney for 22 years, and I've had the privilege of knowing this family since Elliot and Solange were children." He looked at the room. Not at Elliot specifically, at the room, the way you address a room when what you are saying belongs to everyone in it. "I've been the trustee of the Meridian Road property since Raymond's passing. It's been he paused, and in the pause I heard the echo of 6 years of quarterly meetings, of capital improvements logs and vacancy rate analyses, and the insurance claim that had come in at $23,700, a privilege to observe how that property has been managed." He looked at his phone, briefly, with the specificity of a man who knows what is on it. I want to share that as of this morning, the deed transfer on the Meridian Road property was recorded by the county recorder's office. The property now belongs to Solange Vance, outright. The transfer reflects 6 years of documented management that I evaluated in my capacity as trustee and found to be, the pause again, calibrated, exemplary.
He sat down.
He picked up his wine glass. He took a sip. He set it back on the table and looked at no one in particular, in the manner of a man who has said the accurate thing and has no additional commentary to offer. 53 people in the Carmichael room. I watched the information move through the room the way it had moved through the room at the pavilion, at the Christmas dinner, at every room where a truth finally arrives after a long time being kept in a folder, not all at once, but in the specific order of people's proximity to the center of the situation and their ability to receive what they were hearing. Camille's cousins, the two pleasant people assembling the map, looked at each other with a specific expression of people who have just learned that the map they were given had a significant feature incorrectly labeled. The cousin to my right, a woman named Thea who had told me during the cocktail hour that she worked in commercial real estate, pressed her lips together and nodded very slightly, the nod of a professional recognizing something she has seen the shape of before. My mother had both hands on the table now. Her left hand was flat. Her right hand was curled loosely around the stem of her wine glass. She had not lifted it. Camille looked at Elliot. Elliot had set his wine glass down. His hands were on the table in front of him, and he was looking at Philip with the expression, I know this expression well, I've been watching his face for 30 years, of a man who has just discovered that the room he thought he understood contains a dimension he had not measured.
He did not speak.
The string quartet, which had been on a break, chose this particular moment to retake their positions. The soft sound of them tuning, a brief, scattered chord, not quite music yet, came from the corner of the room, and the sound had the effect of returning the room to its physical reality. The white linens, the eucalyptus, the low lighting of the Carmichael room, the salad plates that were still being cleared by the catering staff, who moved with the trained invisibility of professionals who have learned to be in rooms without registering what happens in them. My Aunt Dorothea picked up her wine glass.
She looked at me.
She raised the glass very slightly in my direction, not a toast, too small for that. And then she drank and put it down and picked up her fork for the entree that was beginning to arrive. I lifted my water glass. I took another sip. I set it back in the same ring on the linen. The dinner continued. I want to describe the conversation I had with Camille after the dinner, because it is the part one did not anticipate and the part that has stayed with me most clearly in the 14 months since. I had expected Elliot to say something before the evening ended. He did not. He moved through the rest of the dinner, the toasts that came after, the desserts, the organized departure of guests, with the surface composure of a man who has decided to deal with something later, which is a decision I recognized because I had made it myself on many occasions. He shook hands and embraced guests and thanked them for coming and did all of it correctly, in the mechanical way of a person whose body knows the script even when his attention is elsewhere. Camille found me near the coat check at the end of the evening, in the brief window between her parents departing and Elliot appearing from the room where the final logistics were being managed with the venue. She was still in her dress, ivory, simple, the dress of a woman who had planned this evening carefully and had not planned for what happened in the middle of it. She looked at me with a directness that I recognized as the directness of a woman trying to decide quickly what kind of conversation to have and how much time she had to have it. She said, I didn't know. I said, I know. She said, about any of it. The property, the management, she stopped. She looked at the coat check counter. I've been hearing the version of this family that Elliot tells. I think I should probably hear the other version at some point. I said I thought that was reasonable. She said she was sorry for what he had said. I said I appreciated that. I told her the property was mine now, which was the most efficient summary of the situation available at that moment, and that anything else could wait until after the wedding if she wanted to talk about it. She said she did want to talk about it. She said she would call me. She called me 12 days after the wedding. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. That conversation is its own story, and not one I'm going to tell here. except to say that Camille is a careful and precise person and that the conversation was neither comfortable nor dishonest, and that I came away from it with a different understanding of what the word sister-in-law might eventually mean. What followed in the months after the rehearsal dinner and the wedding had the quality that consequences always have when an antagonist has built their own architecture of exposure. They arrived not from anything I did but from the structure Elliot had erected over 8 years and which collapsed one beam at a time under the weight of the accurate version. The business associate from the 4th of July party, the man Elliot had told about the rental situation that practically ran itself, called Elliot 3 weeks after the rehearsal dinner after having dinner with Thea, Camille's cousin who worked in commercial real estate. I learned about this from my mother, who learned about it from Camille, who mentioned it as a fact rather than a complaint. The conversation between Elliot and the business associate is not something I have direct knowledge of, but the outcome, that the business associate withdrew from a joint venture discussion that had been in progress for several months, was documented in a brief and professional email that Elliot forwarded to me without comment, as though I might want to know. I was not sure what he intended by sending it. I filed it with the other documents I maintain, because that is what I do with information that may be relevant later. Philip's quarterly meeting with me, in January, included a review of the Meridian Road property under my full ownership and a discussion of what the next phase of management would look like, whether I wanted to engage a professional property management company, whether I wanted to continue self-managing, whether I had considered the market for the property itself given the current valuation. We talked for 2 hours. At the end he said, in his particular way, that my father had been very careful about that trust provision and very specific about what the evaluation criteria should be, and that he had understood, when he drafted it, that the criteria would take time to demonstrate. He said he thought Raymond would have been satisfied. I said, I thought so too. I manage the property myself. I have not decided to sell. Marcus is still in the lower unit, 12 years now, and the porch remains in excellent condition. Gwen retired and her daughter moved in, which required a new lease that I handled through the standard process. The building is in good repair, the net operating income continues to improve modestly year over year, and the capital improvements log I have maintained since I was 22 is one of the more complete records of a residential property in the city, according to the insurance adjuster who reviewed it last spring and who said he wished every property owner he dealt with kept documentation like this. My relationship with Elliot is not repaired, in the sense that the word repair implies a return to a previous condition. What we had before was not a relationship I want to return to, it was an arrangement I had accepted because I did not yet understand that I was accepting it, and which I am not willing to re-enter now that I do. We communicate when family occasions require it. The communication is correct and brief. At his wedding, the day after the rehearsal dinner, I was present and behaved as a sister should behave at a wedding because the occasion deserved that, and because Camille deserved that, and because the statement I had to make had already been made at 9:43 the previous evening by Philip Osei and did not require me to make it again. My mother and I talk every week. She has not apologized for what she did not say at the rehearsal dinner, which was everything. She has not, to my knowledge, corrected Elliot's version of our family's history with anyone who received it. What she has done since the rehearsal dinner is ask me questions about the Meridian Road property, how it's doing, whether the tenants are okay, whether I've thought about the roof, which she knows from 20 years of watching my father manage it needs attention every decade. These questions are her version of something. I receive them as such. I have been thinking for the 14 months since the Carmichael room about what it means to own something. Not in the legal sense. The legal sense was resolved on October 9th at 9:04 in the morning, when Philip Osei filed the relevant documents and the county recorder's office stamped them, and my name was put on the record as the owner of the property at Meridian Road in a form that could not be undone by a speech at a rehearsal dinner or a narrative assembled over 8 years from accurate pieces that added up to a lie. In the other sense, the sense in which you own something because you understood it, maintained it, made decisions about it at 10 at night when something broke and at 9 in the morning when the insurance adjuster called, because you showed up for it in the specific, unglamorous, often invisible way that is the actual content of ownership when the cameras are off and the toasts have been given and the room has emptied out. What I own on Meridian Road is the roof I protected and the furnace I replaced and the tenant who stayed 12 years because the porch was kept well and the landlord answered the phone. What I own is the vacancy rate of 0 for the last 4 years and the net operating income that Philip noted in his quarterly reviews with the precision of a man who measured things carefully and knew the difference between a number and a story. Elliot stood up at the rehearsal dinner and told 53 people that I was nothing, in front of the man who had spent the morning putting my name on the deed. He built the room he thought he was walking into. Philip Osei simply described the room that already existed. The work you put into something is not erased because someone tells a different story about it. The record is still there. The record is always there if you kept it carefully, and I have kept it carefully since I was 22 years old and my father died and left me a property in trust and an instruction implicit in the trust conditions to prove that I could be trusted with it. I proved it. It took 6 years, and it was quiet, and it was unglamorous, and no one gave a toast for it. But the deed is filed, and the roof is sound, and Marcus still keeps the porch better than my father ever did, and the capital improvements log is the most complete record of a residential property the insurance adjuster has reviewed this year. Sometimes the record speaks for itself. And sometimes the person who filed it is sitting at table 6 with his phone face down and his hands folded, waiting for exactly the right moment to tell the room what the record says. Here is what I keep turning over, and I want to ask you. When Philip Osei stood up at 9:43 in the Carmichael room and addressed 53 people who had just heard my brother say, "I own nothing," which word do you think landed hardest? Exemplary. Just that one word, from a man who had been measuring the work for 6 years and had never once used it carelessly. If something in this story reflected something you have built in silence, the work that didn't get the toast, the record no one asked to see until they had to, leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if you're new here, subscribe. There is more where this came from. Take care of yourselves.